Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Monday, week 11, I think. Hope everyone had a good weekend. I think almost everyone has turned in their micro papers, so thank you very much. I will be marking those like crazy this week to get them back to you. I will also give you the assignment for the final paper probably tomorrow. I'm just kind of fine-tuning it a little bit, so I'll give you that. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say about that so far. We can talk about it a little more tomorrow when I actually present it to you, and of course the final paper will take place of the good morning. The final paper will take the place of a final exam, so there is no final exam in this class. And I think I will try to make the final paper due on the last day of class. That way you can finish it and then you can move on to your other exams in your other classes and you don't have to worry about this. How does that sound? A+, that sounds good? Nicholas, you okay with that? I know you just walked into.
Yeah, I guess.
Okay. Final paper.
Last day of class.
Yeah, what do you think?
When's the last day?
Then I think it's the 9th, April the 9th. It's April 9th. Yeah. And I would assign it to you tomorrow. So you would have a few weeks to work on it. Then you would hand it in on the last day. Then you would be 3 weeks. We can talk about it a little more as we go on. But that's kind of my plan. And again, it allows you to, finish it, and then you can move on with your other exams.
We're done with tests, right?
Huh?
We're done with tests. Are we done with tests?
We got one more quiz to do. And I think we said we would do it on April 1st. So, yeah, and that way it gives me enough time to mark them as well, right? Okay, well, enough about that. We'll deal with that maybe tomorrow. Let's move. Let's actually say good morning to some people. Shania is here. Good morning, Shania. Simrat is here. Good morning, Simrat. Abby's here. Good morning, Abby. And Ryan is here. Good morning, Ryan. Okay, so where were we on good morning? Thursday, right? On Thursday we were kind of transitioning out of that article, right? We read that academic article from Shavella Pittman about the sort of gendered racism that female professors of color encountered in the classroom, most of it coming from white male students, right? And again, I wanted you to read that article because it's the real deal, right? It's a real academic article. And again, if you have some experience reading those and kind of knowing how they are put together, it will help you, right? I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm not as strategic as I should be. And so I think when I got those papers in university, I just dived in and started reading them. But sometimes you don't have time to just read everything. In university, sometimes you're assigned more than you can actually manage to read, and so you do have to be strategic, and you do have to know how to sort of zero in on the important information and pull it out so that you can move on to other things, because otherwise you'll just be drowning in reading, and so you need some skills to pull that stuff out. Right, so we read that article and we said that, Shavella Pittman said, or argued, more accurately, she argued that, these female professors of color experience gendered racism mostly from white male students. And we talked about a number of ways in which that seemed to be happening. And of course, the question I asked was, well, why are some of these students acting the way they are? And part of the answer, for at least a few of those students is probably that they're jerks. And I'm using a nicer word because I'm on camera here, but they're jerks, right? Sometimes that's just the answer. But there's a larger answer to be explored here as well, and it has to do with messages of white racial superiority. And again, we're talking about race right now, but the same could be said of any type of oppression, right? So if we were looking at gender, there are messages circulating around that men are superior to women, right? We said that part of that was the patriarchy, right? The idea that men are inherently superior to women, and that because of that, they should be the ones making the decisions. They should be the ones in charge, right? Men are the more logical ones, right? The ones who are capable of making good decisions without getting swept away with, emotion and frivolity or whatever it is, right? And so any type of oppression will have these messages that the dominant group is somehow superior to the minoritized group, right? And you can do it for, you can pull those messages out from any type of oppression. But of course, here we're talking about race. And so, so I said that one of the ways that we see messages of white racial superiority played out is in media, right? And so if you look at some of these very popular television shows, you can find probably almost all of these on Netflix, or most of them, or if you have Amazon Prime and Netflix, you can probably watch all of these shows. And by and large, they are about white people, right? They are written by and for white people. The central characters are white people, and usually white men, right? Of course, there are some shows that are a little more diverse. Walking Dead is a little more diverse, I think. What else? American Idol can be diverse, I guess, depending on who shows up on the stage. Glee was reasonably diverse, but I mean, still, it's by and large shows written about and for white people, right? And again, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but well, let me put the three of you on the spot, because the three of you are not white. And so when you watch, sorry to just point it out like that, but when you watch shows like this that are about white people with white central characters, do you does that make you think about it differently? Do you notice it? Do you have thoughts about it? Do you just watch it because it's a show and you don't notice anything? Like how do you interact with that? Does it make a difference to you? Not really?
Yes, I just watch it.
What, you just watch it? There's no, doesn't, it doesn't make you react in any particular way? No. Because I mean, like we've watched Game of Thrones, right? And Game of Thrones is almost entirely white. I'm trying to think of some non-white characters. The Dothraki are probably, you would probably think of them as non-white, although they're kind of a fictional group, but they're kind of non-white. Missandei is probably Daenerys is she becomes Daenerys's interpreter and right-hand person kind of thing. Yeah, she's not white. Neither is Grey Worm.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, but actually, I'm recalling all these names now. I haven't watched it in a while. So there are some non-white characters, but by and large, the major characters are white, right? And again, it makes sense because it's kind of a fictionalized version of Britain, if you will, and so it kind of makes sense. But still, is there a message being unintentionally transmitted, right? The idea that these are the stories that are worth telling, right? These are the stories that are more important. This is the way that we should look at life, right? And again, even if non-white people watching these media don't have those thoughts, it kind of reinforces to a white audience that this is kind of the way reality is, right? These are the values and beliefs we should hold to, the values and beliefs of these characters, right? Yeah, there's the Friends guys, the Justice League, all white. I mentioned Jesus, right? Portrayed as white. And I think that's kind of a big deal, right? Because this is not just, he's not supposed to be, if you're a believer here, but he's not really supposed to be the God of just white people, right? He's the God of the entire universe, right? He is the creative entity, right? He's everything. He's the Alpha and the Omega, as they say in the Bible, the beginning and the end. God is everything. And here he is portrayed as a white person. And, you may shrug your shoulders and say, well, whatever. But think about the sort of implicit message of that, right? God creates man, or humans, in his own image. And that's the image, right? And so I think that's a powerful statement to portray this omnipotent, eternal, all-powerful being, whatever God is, as a white person. I think that's a powerful political statement, saying that this is how you should view the creator of the universe as a white man. I think that's interesting. Yeah, and I pointed out that in real life Jesus might have looked a little more like this, right? This is a more average face for someone from his part of the world 2,000 years ago or so. Of course, we have no idea what the man looked like, but this is probably a lot more accurate than is something like this. But that's who we see portrayed, right? That's how we see Jesus represented. Yeah, and if you go back to all kinds of sort of biblical or Renaissance art, you will see, the art is made by and for Europeans. And so Europeans don't want to see a Middle Eastern Jesus. They want to see a white Jesus, or in this case, a white Adam and Eve. And so here they are, the first people, right? The first people that God creates in the Old Testament in Genesis. And they're depicted as white, right? And again, I think that's a powerful political statement. Whether it's meant to be or not, I think it is. Yeah, and so again, it transmits these messages, if not to a non-white audience, and maybe it does, and maybe it doesn't, but it definitely tells the white audience that they are legitimate, right? They are kind of the default for human experience. Their way of being and thinking and acting, that's normal, right? That's the way humans are, the way white people are. And again, that's not necessarily true, but the dominant group is the one who gets to create these messages. The dominant group is the one who controls the kind of narrative around what's normal and what's not, right? One of the things that you often hear from people of color, particularly with media, is, they feel that in watching, movies or television shows in the past, sometimes you'll hear people of color say, well, I was watching these shows and I didn't see me represented, right? I didn't see anyone who looked like me. And because of that, I didn't feel there was a place for me, right? I didn't feel that I was legitimate. I didn't feel like, I could or do or should do any of these things. And then when I saw whatever show or then when I saw Black Panther or something, suddenly I felt like, wow, there's a place for my identity, right? I too can be this and do this, right? And so, again, whether or not that's true, think about the message that white people are getting when they are always getting that message, right? They're always getting the message that they belong, that there's a place for them, that they can and should do the kinds of things they see in media. And again, I'm not saying that's wrong. I mean, we should empower people through media, right? There's nothing wrong. But when we're only empowering one group, that's where the problem comes in, right? And other people constantly feel like, not constantly, but often feel like they don't have, there isn't that room for them, right? There isn't that space for them. I don't know, does that make sense? Okay, so, oh right. So, yeah, in movies, we said movies are important agents of socialization, but I threw some statistics at you, and the statistics are there's some pretty big numbers here, right? Basically, almost all of the highest grossing films, so the films that most people have seen, or at least seen over and over again, are written and directed and created by white people, and mostly by white men, right? So again, who's controlling social messaging? Who is figuring out what stories to tell and how they want to tell those stories, right? What's that? You're answering my question? Yeah, white people are, right? And again, this is important too, because think of, I talked about this concept of the white savior sort of movie, and there's tons and tons of them out there, although less so now because people are kind of conscious of this idea, and so they're trying not to make this movie anymore. But often these movies are about white people saving people of color, right? And so there's lots and lots of them. Obviously, the one on the right is a bit of a joke. White people solve racism. You're welcome, black people. Obviously, that's a bit of a joke, but also not, because a lot of these movies have that kind of plot line to them, right? And so I gave you some sort of characteristics. Good morning. I gave you some characteristics of that that type of movie where, yeah, sometimes you have an outsider, sometimes you have a white person going to a foreign country. Good morning. Sometimes a white person, going to to a ghetto or to a sort of a low-class neighborhood, and somehow they rescue people of color in some way, right? And this can be sort of heroically, or it can be, often a woman adopting a child of color. That will often show up in plot lines too. I use this example from my own childhood, where here a white man falls from the sky and rescues a village full of Indian people, right? And it's, it's not meant to be a racist film, and in most ways I don't think it is. You could argue in some ways that it is, but it's that same narrative, right? That morality and heroism, those things are kind of the domain of white people, and people of color are kind of just passive. They're not able to sort of make any change for themselves. They need this guy to show up and save the day, right? Which of course he does, because he's the hero. But again, is there a kind of a problematic message under the surface? And in some ways there definitely is. Now we were introducing kind of this idea of white supremacism, and I had you read an article, because again, sometimes it's tricky, right, in a class like this, because you want to make sure that the voices of marginalized and minoritized groups are represented, that we're kind of talking about and learning about minoritized groups. But it's also important to look at the dominant group as well, right? Because the dominant group is the one who is, who is in power, and who is kind of in some ways creating this power inequality within society. And so, yes, I'm giving a lot of airtime to these white supremacists, and maybe I shouldn't. Maybe we shouldn't pay attention to them. But it is a force in some countries, in this country, and in the United States. And so, we do kind of have to pay attention to these groups and kind of learn about them. It seems like it might be more fitting to learn about minoritized groups and talk about what's going on for them, but I don't know. Maybe it's a balance, I guess is what I'm saying. So we know that in North America and in Europe, white people are the dominant group, right? They have control over basically all social institutions. And if we look at the stats, white people have better financial and health and educational outcomes than people of color, right? So we know that things are going much better for white people in Western countries than for people of color. But what's kind of interesting is that white supremacists aren't in agreement with that. Many white supremacists feel that they're in the minority. They're the ones that are under threat. They're the ones that are, people are trying to exterminate, sort of thing. So it's a weird reversal. Even though the data tells us one thing, white supremacists kind of think something else. And so I gave you this article to read, and there's a bunch of stuff in here that we can talk about, but I think I need to give you a little bit of time just to review the article itself before we can dig back into it, because it's been 3 days, and I'm sure we all don't remember Thursday very well. So let's take 8 minutes or so. We'll look back over this article, get ready to talk about these questions, and then we'll do so, okay? Okay, people. So there's kind of lots going on in that article, but there's probably a little too much detail for us to remember specifically, but there are some things we should definitely talk about. The first question, I know I asked you this on Thursday, but I'll ask you again. What's the major cause of domestic terrorism in the United States, or who? Terrorists, and who are those terrorists? Yeah, they're white guys, right? By and large, they are white guys. I don't think it actually shows up in the article, but if I asked you how would you describe terrorism to me? What makes something a terrorist act? It's one of those things like you feel like you know what it is, but what is it? What is terrorism? What is terrorism? I know you're looking it up there, Mulder, so what does it say?
Unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against affiliated in the pursuit of political aims.
Right. So it's the use of violence and the use of threat of violence, so hence the terror part. But it's always connected with some sort of political outcome or political aim. Okay. So again, if you are literally a mentally ill person and you go and shoot a bunch of people, it's not terrorism, right? It's if you're not trying to accomplish some sort of political aim, it's not terrorism. You're just a nut, right? You're just crazy. But people who are terrorists are trying to accomplish some kind of political goal, or they're trying to make some kind of political statement, right? And so that's kind of the difference. Although, maybe it doesn't matter so much if you're talking about, acts of violence against large numbers of people. Maybe it's not important to figure out political agendas or not, but technically that's what terrorism is. And again, it's important to note here because I think if you asked most Americans and Canadians probably, if you said, hey, close your eyes and picture a terrorist in your head, we said that most people would probably picture a Middle Eastern or Muslim man, right? Probably with a beard and the suicide vest and the whole thing. But, if you look at what's happening in the United States, that's not really what the data shows us, right? The data shows us that domestic terrorism, so terrorism within the United States, is almost exclusively committed by white people, right? With very few exceptions. And so again, that kind of challenges, I think, the stereotype that Western people and that Americans have about terrorism, because it's easy to think that terrorism comes from outside, right? Terrorism is something that the other group engages in, right? The minoritized group. But again, that's not what the data shows us, right? The data shows us that it is white people that commit terrorism in the United States. Let me see this question here. What kinds of views are held by the radical right? Okay, let's talk about this. This is what makes this subject a little bit complicated, but what kind of views are held by the radical right? What kind of views do they have? Yeah, so people in the radical right are often anti-abortion, right? And so, what else? Give me more. Anti-abortion is one part of their views sometimes. right? So they're often anti-immigration, anti-immigrant. What else are they? Sometimes.
Basically discrimination against
In a certain way, yeah, right? They tend to be anti-abortion, anti-immigration. There's often an element of Christianity kind of woven in there. There is a rejection of homosexuality kind of mixed in there. There's ideas of white supremacism and white nationalism that we'll talk about in a second. All these things are there's lots of misogynistic things tied up. There's lots of anger and violence. And so, again, when you look at some of these groups on the radical right, it's kind of hard to say specifically what their thing is, right? What their belief system is, because they're kind of pushing back or reacting violently to all kinds of things, right? Whether it's multiculturalism or immigration or the changing economy of the United States or people with non-Christian religions or abortion or women or homosexuality or diverse sexualities or genders or all of those things at the same time, right? And so they're kind of a complicated group because, again, there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of lashing out, and what they choose to lash out at tends to vary quite a bit, right? I think that's kind of what I'm getting at in both questions 3 and 4. The idea that these groups of people have a lot of they're opposed to a lot of different things, but it kind of depends which group you're talking to, and maybe even which individual person you're talking to in terms of who their grievances are focused at, right? Who is to blame for, who is to blame for the state of where they are right now? And I think that's kind of what I'm thinking about for question 4 as well, is that the views held around abortion are complex because they are, in some cases, religious, right? So religious groups will often have specific ideas about that abortion cannot happen, right? Because the idea is that God creates this life, and you may not destroy that life. It is not, God has created it. It is not, you do not have permission to destroy it, right? And I think Catholics feel the same way about suicide, right? Your life is a gift from God, and therefore you may not simply throw it away. So the views around abortion are complex because, again, they have a religious element to them as well. What are white supremacists fighting for? What do they think they're fighting for? What are white supremacists fighting for? What's their thing? I can wait.
White supremacy.
Yeah. What are they fighting for? What do they believe in?
White supremacy.
Okay, well, give me what does that mean to you? They're what?
The white people are better than everyone else.
Right. They feel they believe very strongly that white people are genetically superior, right? That the white race is is supreme, is superior, and that they feel that they should therefore have control over people of color, right? Or people of color should be separated out from society, or people of color should just not be in American society. They should, go back home, or quote unquote, right? Of course, we know that that flies directly in the face of science, right, and factual information, right? We already know that there are no biological human races, right? Things that humans use to divide people into races are, genetically speaking, not that significant, right? They're not that big of a difference. They look like a big difference to our eyes, but when you look at the genetics, you see there's just not that much difference between human beings, right? White supremacists also, what else do white supremacists believe? Right, they need to fight for their survival of their race because their race is under threat, right? Do you think that's true? Why not? Because what? Yeah, as it turns out, they are the dominant group, right? We know that. We can very clearly look around at heads of social institutions and see lots of white people. We see lots of white people represented in the government. We see lots of white people represented in media. So my question then to you is why do you think that they feel this way? Why do you think that some white people, not all white people of course, but why do white supremacists feel that they're under threat when in fact the data kind of shows that they're not? What do you think is going on there? Why would... Okay. It's possible that maybe their ancestors came from Germany, but also what's possible, it's possible, but I will refute this, because the article said that, in most cases, people who wind up joining white supremacist groups are not, don't come from white supremacist households, right? Some of them, they said they report being exposed to kind of racist ideas when they're young, but it's not like their parents are white supremacists, right? And so, yeah, they may pick up some ideas about, racial superiority from their home, from growing up, but what else might be the case? Why else might people feel they're under threat when in fact, technically they're not? They don't have free health care? Okay, well, let's pull that apart a little bit. So they don't have free health care. What else might they not have? Jobs? What else? Economic security, maybe, right? Something that you may or may not know about the United States, and maybe the Western world as a whole, is that over the past, let's say over the past 40 to 50 years, the economy in countries like Canada and the United States has changed quite a bit, okay? So if you go back to let's say 1910 or let's say 1920, if you go back 100 years, you would find that in the US and in Canada, there was a lot of manufacturing happening here, okay? Canada and the US were building a lot of things, and in fact, it contributed to a huge economic boom in the 1920s. And so if you know anything about history in this part of the world, you might have heard of the Roaring 20s or you might have seen the Roaring Twenties in movies. And the Roaring Twenties are, in some ways, awesome because there's lots of technological innovation, there's lots of economic activity, lots of people have jobs, there's money flying around. It's like the Great Gatsby kind of thing, people drinking and dancing and having fun. It's a crazy time to be alive for a lot of people, not for everybody. But that whole boom is fueled on manufacturing. And for decades later, manufacturing was a really comfortable way for Canadians and Americans to make a living. And so you would, most people, what they would do is they would go to high school, they would graduate, they would get a job in a factory, probably maybe even the same factory that their father had worked in, and they would get paid really well, and they'd be able to afford to buy a house, and they'd get married, and they'd have their kids, and then when they were 55 or 60 or so, they would retire, and the factory would give them a nice pension, and then they'd, retire comfortably, right? And it was a nice way to make a living. It was very comfortable. You didn't need to go to university, and millions and millions of Americans and Canadians kind of had this sort of life trajectory, right? It was very kind of predictable, right? And you got out of high school, you got your factory job, you worked hard in the factory, and your life was kind of assured, right? Your financial success was assured. But as you probably instinctively know, where is everything made nowadays? Yeah, everything is made in China, right? And to some degree, Southeast Asian countries and India and a few other places. But everything is made in China now. Those manufacturing jobs that so many Americans and Canadians used to work, they don't exist anymore. They have all moved to other countries, right? And so what's kind of happened is that group of people in the US and Canada who used to be kind of in the middle class, who used to be factory workers, who had that life that I just described to you, they've kind of all slipped down the ladder a little bit because those manufacturing jobs were paying quite reasonably well, especially for people with no real education. Those jobs were paying really well, but when they left, when they went overseas, nothing really replaced it. What replaced it was kind of service level jobs. And so those people kind of slipped down the economic ladder a little bit. And in order to climb it, they need actually a lot more education than they used to, right? Once upon a time, you could make a good living for your family and afford a house and a car and support your wife and kids and everything on your factory job with a high school diploma, and that's it. You could do that. But can you do that today? Doubtful, right? High school jobs with, where you have a high school diploma, those jobs don't pay enough for you to be able to do that. You need extra training or university or something, right? You usually need more. And so, again, it's kind of changed because that group of people who used to be sitting in the middle class, kind of just going to work and punching the clock and making their money, they've all slid down the economic ladder. And so they kind of look back and they think, well, what happened, right? Because my father and my grandfather, they only had high school diplomas and they went off to work and made enough money to support their families, right? Whereas I, and actually this is kind of true of me, I need 3 degrees and I still don't make as much money as my dad used to make, right? That seems wrong, right? That seems wrong. It seems like I should be able to, if things are continually getting better and better and I have more education, in theory, I should be able to make way more money. But that's not the way it's going for a lot of people in North America, right? For a lot of people in North America, their wages and their standard of living has actually declined, right? While the richest people continue to get richer, and we'll talk about that when we get to classism, middle class people, their wages have stagnated or actually gone down. And so for white people who have been here for several generations, some of these men are looking around and saying, "Hey, what's wrong?" Right? We used to, I used to be guaranteed a comfortable living. I used to be guaranteed economic security, and now something's gone wrong, right? I'm working hard all day long for minimum wage. I've got no money. I can't afford anything. Where did we go wrong, right? And so some of these people, not everyone, right, but some of these guys I think are looking for the scapegoat, right? Who is to blame for my social and economic problems, right? Who is to blame for the fact that I cannot make the kind of money that my father and my grandfather did? Maybe not so much my grandfather, but my father. My grandfather worked in a meat packing plant, so he was cutting up hams all day for like 40 years. That was his job. But again, the economy has changed, and for a lot of people, it hasn't changed for the better for them. And so again, I think some of these white supremacists are responding to economic pressures, right? Why do I not get what I think should be coming to me, right? Why am I not getting what I feel I am entitled to? And so, and there's no easy answers to that, right? The world has changed. The world is far more globalized. Economies are far more globally integrated than they used to be, right? In the 1920s, the US was very isolationist, right? It traded with other countries, but its economy was kind of based on just stuff within the United States, right? Now, again, that's not the case. If we stop trading with China, we won't have anything, right? Because we don't make much here. Everything is made over there. And so things have changed a lot in 100 years, but some people feel that they're still entitled to that lifestyle from the past, right? And that's not the way it is anymore. The other thing I'll say maybe that I'll add in here, and then we'll take a break, also I think has to do with misogyny. And so if you know anything about the history of women in the Western world, women have been regaining their equality for decades, and we're not there yet, right? We haven't achieved equality, but definitely for the past, since about the 1960s, maybe the 1970s, women have made huge gains in regaining equality, right? And so women can work in just about any industry now. Women can technically be whatever they want to be. They can go to any school they want to go to. Women have high-powered careers in which they make lots of money. And because women have kind of redefined their gender role to some degree, it's also forced men to redefine their gender roles as well, right? Think back to that documentary we saw with the boys in Lesotho, right? With Shwe Shwe and her friend were at school. They were talking to those two young men, and the two young men were saying, well, no, I don't want my wife to make more money than me, because then she'll control me. Or, if I'm not the provider in the household, then like, what am I, right? What good am I? And that's kind of the process that men have gone through in the Western world here. If women can do all the things that men can do, and they can, then what is a man? What is a man good for? What is a man supposed to be? And so I think a lot of these guys are kind of tied up in the economic thing, but also trying to figure out what it is to be a man. Because in the 1950s, you had much clearer gender roles, right? You knew what women were supposed to be, you knew what men were supposed to be. Those things were kind of separate, the end, right? But now it's much more confusing, right? It's much more difficult to know, how do you be a good man, right? How do you do that in the world we live in? And again, in the 1950s, I'm not saying it was better because it wasn't, but it was a lot more clear cut, right? It was a lot more. The lines were much more clearly drawn in terms of how to be a man. Today, it's not so clear, right? And so, again, I think a lot of these guys are reacting to the changing economy and the fact that, you know, the things that used to be given to them are not given anymore. And they're still struggling with the idea that, you know, we've redefined gender roles. Some people are talking about throwing gender out altogether. And some of these guys are like, hey, like, what am I? What am I? Who am I? What am I supposed to be, right? If I can't be the provider, you know, if women are going out there and earning all the money, if immigrants are taking all of our jobs, which they're not, but some people complain about that. If all those things are happening, who am I? And why am I not successful? And if I'm not successful, whose fault is that? Right? I think that's a lot of what's kind of fueling the sort of anger and frustration that white supremacists have, I think. Anyway, let's take a break. We'll come back. We'll talk about white supremacists, white nationalists, the alt-right, and then I have a little video to show you, okay? So, but we'll take a break first. All right. We are back. I'm sorry for the delay. Yes. So before the break, we were talking about white supremacists, right? And the idea that they feel that, sorry, I just ran all the way up here. Yeah, they believe in the superiority of the white race, that they are genetically superior, and that therefore other people have to be either subordinated or segregated or simply removed from society somehow, right? And again, before the break, I tried to give you a little bit of historical context because a lot of this stuff is kind of tangled up in knots, right? There's some racism, there's some sexism, there's some misogyny, there's some heterosexism or sort of discrimination against homosexual people. There's some Christian elements woven into this, right, with the abortion thing and with other ideas. And it's kind of a tangled mess, right, of people who are angry and upset and, you know, are kind of looking for someone to lash out at. And again, it almost depends on who you ask in terms of what they're lashing out at. What's white nationalism? Yeah, it kind of has to do with national identity and kind of what the country should be, right? And so white nationalists have this idea, either explicitly or implicitly, that the nation itself, I guess America is what we're talking about here, America should be a white nation, right? And that the culture of the US should be white, the religion should be Christian, people in power should be white, and the country should be run according to kind of white culture or white values, whatever those are. That's kind of what white nationalists are thinking about. And you know, I think Donald Trump is probably a good example of a white nationalist. I don't know that he's a white supremacist necessarily, but I think he holds a lot of these ideas himself, whether he kind of thinks about it or not. He feels that, you know, white people are the most competent, the most sort of cultured, and they're the ones who should be in power. They're the ones who should be in charge. And again, I don't think he clearly expresses this all the time, but I think in part that's what his thing is. He's a bit of a white nationalist. And what's the alt-right? What is the alt-right? Because we've probably heard about the alt-right quite a bit in the last few years. If you've been following Western news anyway, you'll have heard about them. What is the alt-right? Somebody tell me. I'm dying up here. Good morning. Okay, so what does it mean to be conservative? No. Here, let me show you this. Which slide is it on now? Oh, it's on this one. Good. I'm just going to move my head out of the way here. Here. This is kind of what we need. We need the political spectrum. Has anyone ever seen this kind of thing before? some sort of graphic like that? No? Okay. In politics, you'll often hear about people being right wing or left wing, or on the left or on the right, or, we're talking about the alt-right. Sometimes you'll hear about the alt-left or the radical right. There's these two kind of hands, there's these two sides that are being referenced. And in general, this is what people are talking about. And you can define the difference between left and right in some ways in a very simple fashion, okay? So it has to do with what people feel is the role of government, okay? And the role of government in people's kind of social lives and the role of government in people's political or economic lives, okay? So if you go out on the right, where we kind of currently are with this white supremacist stuff, people who are out on the right feel, A, that the government should not be involved in people's economic lives, okay? So people on the right like kind of low regulations for business, they like low taxes, not a lot of government programs, not a lot of government handouts, they don't want the government regulating the economy or businesses. They just want the government to kind of stay out of it and let the economic system run on its own, right? Let the market run on its own. Let some people be really successful. Let other businesses fail if they're not good enough. Everybody works hard and it all comes out in the wash, kind of thing. So people on the right wing are very much in favor of the government kind of staying out of people's business, not regulating too much, not telling everyone what to do all the time, just letting the economy and letting people kind of do as they will, okay? The opposite side is on the left, and so people on the left feel that, in fact, the government should be involved in people's lives, right? People on the left like things like pensions and unemployment insurance and social programs and free health care and things like that, right? People on the left feel that, yeah, actually the government should get involved in regulating the market and making sure that, people who make tons of money are taxed more and people who make no money are taxed less. And, we use all this tax money to provide social programs, right? That's kind of what people on the left are about. So they're okay with higher taxes as long as it means more government support, right? More social programs. If you look at people's social lives, people on the right are often more interested or feel the government should be more involved in their social life. So people on the right care a lot more about this sort of like traditions, like maintaining traditions, maintaining the status quo, keeping things the way they are. That's the conservative part that you were talking about there, Mulder. They're conservative. They don't really like change. They like to keep things as they are, right? Sometimes people on the right are more religious. That kind of tends to go hand in hand with tradition and religion. So sometimes people on the right are more religious. People on the left, on the other hand, feel that government shouldn't really have much involvement in people's social lives, right? So the government shouldn't really be, well, maybe what I'll say is people on the left wing are more accepting of difference, of diversity, of different genders, different sexualities. They tend to be more open to immigration. They tend to be less concerned with keeping things the way they are and instead, being open to change, being open to making things better, sort of thing. That's kind of what people on the left are about. And so, again, you can almost think of it as the government as a parent, okay? So what kind of parent do you want? Do you want a parent that kind of, yeah, they're there, they're kind of an authority figure, but they just kind of leave you to live your life and they don't interfere with your life too much? Or do you want the kind of parent who is more supportive, who is kind of there for you and helping you out? Sometimes they're in your business a little more than you would like, but they're very supportive and they're kind of always around. What kind of parent do you want, right? And people on the right, they kind of want the first parent. They want the authoritative parent who kind of stays out of their business. People on the left want a little more softer, cushier parent who's much more supportive, but the downside is that they're in your business a lot more than the other parent is. So again, it kind of depends what you want, right? And so here you can see in the US, the Democrats are on the left, so they want that softer, cushier parent, but the Republicans are on the right, and they want that more authoritative, more hands-off parent. But of course, the further out you go, the more extreme these ideas get. And so if you continue toward the right to the end of the spectrum, you'll hit fascism, right? Where the government is entirely in control of people's lives. They're very interested in who their country is in terms of tradition and nationality. You know, look at Adolf Hitler and his attempt to purge Germany of everyone who was not ethnically German, right? Very, very interested in who his citizens were, right? If you go all the way out to the left, you'll find communism, right? A system that is so supportive that it provides basically everything for people, right? Everybody works for the state, everybody gets everything they need through the state.
Wait, so if the communism, if you go all the way to the left and it's communism, does that mean that the government is going to do everything but not freedom?
Well, that's the thing, right? Is that the further out you go, the political system is often so extreme that it seems to require an authoritarian government. So a government that tells everybody what to do all the time. And if you don't do what you're supposed to, big trouble, right? And so that's kind of where communism and fascism get confused, because they both tend to have sort of authoritative governments that sort of quash or squash individual freedom, right? The state comes first for both communists and fascists, but their ideas are actually quite a bit different. And historically, fascists have been the enemies of communists, but not always. They have a complicated relationship. But again, most of what you find in a Western society is people who are pretty close to the center, okay? So most people in Canada, for instance, are, you know, kind of in that yellowy area. They're in the middle. They lean a little left or they lean a little right. Most people are not quite so extreme in their views, right? As for me, I lean a little bit to the left. I don't think I'm in favor of full-on socialism, but Canada is a country with socialist elements in it, right? Our healthcare system is a socialist idea. And actually it was proposed by a socialist party back in, was it the 1940s or the 1950s? I think it might have been the 1940s. Nope, hang on. 50s. So it's a socialist idea that we have. But anyway, most people sit close to the center, although in the US it feels like people are leaning further and further out toward the extremes, right? The Republican Party seems to be drifting pretty far right as of late, almost flirting with some fascist elements. And some Democrats are leaning pretty hard left, right? And if you pay attention to people like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, both of them lean pretty far left, so they're almost kind of getting into the socialism area, right? So things are a little more polarized in the States. People are leaning further left or further right. Here in Canada, people are a lot closer to the center, and I think as a country as a whole, we kind of lean a little bit left on average. We're pretty close to the center, but we lean a little left. The US on average leans a little bit right, okay? But again, that's how you can sort of describe people's political ideas or what they think about the government. And so the alt-right or the radical right, or whoever you want to call them, these are people who are out on the right wing, but they're not just simple conservatives, right? They are way out there, right, in terms of some of their views. But kind of out of time for today, so we'll talk about those guys a little bit tomorrow. And like I mentioned, I have a very short, not very short, maybe 10-minute or so video to show you on some white supremacists, and we can actually hear what some of these guys are talking about. Okay. But until then, I will end it here. We'll come back to this tomorrow. Have a nice afternoon. I'll see you then. Yes.